You know, if I was to visit your manufacturing facility, I am pretty certain I would find a lot of measurement devices.
Sure.
Depends what you make, but I might find micrometers, calipers, torque wrenches maybe, pressure gauges for sure, height gauges, precision scales. A lot of people have scales. Counting scales. Almost everybody's got a counting scale, and so forth. And all of these devices have to be calibrated from time to time. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the variation inherent in our entire gauge calibration / control system, our measurement system, is an often overlooked part of the journey to reducing variation in our manufacturing process. We go to great lengths to understand variation in our processes and often ignore the variation in the tools that we use to measure that process. So if you think about it, if the tools are off, your measurement's off, and you don't actually know what your process is doing, right? So most of the improvement efforts in organizations are spent on reducing variation among products. Little, if any, attention is paid to the variation introduced into the overall picture due to the measurement system. Our next guest is an expert in measurement system variation and how R&R studies can help us understand and reduce measurement system variation. Eric Gasper is the author of Assessing the Health of a Measurement System. R&R studies ensure your measurement system can measure process variation. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hi, Derek. Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for being here. Well, you know, you said something really interesting, and that was really true in your article. You wrote, I'm going to quote here, most of the improvement efforts in organizations are spent on reducing variation among products. Little, if any, attention is paid to the variation introduced into the overall picture due to the measurement system. So can you elaborate on what you meant there?
Sure. So for anybody that's like a quality manager or a quality department, one of their key focuses is going to be trying to reduce any variation that's coming off the production line. The parts that you're making, the products that you're producing, you're going to be spending a lot of your focus, attention, and energy into making sure that the products that are being made are going to, basically hit the specifications, hit the tolerances so that we can sell these, ship these, make our customers happy. So they're inundated with a lot of information. They utilize different tools, SPC tools. We're going to use control charts and histograms to evaluate the stability of our process, the health of our process. But if somebody brings you or brings me a control chart and everything's out of control, everybody's first reaction is, oh, we need to do something. We need to make a change. We need to shut down production. We need to buy a new part, buy a new product. So I guess my point is that very few times do you have to kind of sit and consider, I wonder if these measurements are valid. Have we done a check on the measurement system itself? And are we potentially just getting out of control points because the measurement system has become unhinged? So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. And probably the only thing I want to share with the different listeners and users today is that when you do have an issue, you do have a problem on your production line, or a control chart goes out of control, or your capability is not where you want it to be, take a moment, take a breath, and think and say, hey, when was the last time we did an R&R study? Or when was the last time we evaluated the operators? Do they know how to use the measurement device? Because when you do that, all it does is build trust in the fact that when I look at that control chart, I can make good decisions based off that information.
And briefly, I mean, you just mentioned R&R, and that actually is the topic of a webinar that's coming up next week. But what is, just in general terms, what is an R&R study? What do we mean by that when we say that? And I guess there's different types. There's a gauge R&R, but I think in this context, you're talking about an R&R that's even broader than that.
Yeah, so a gauge R&R, or measurement R&R, or really any way you kind of want to slice and dice it, and it's just an experiment. It's a way to try and duplicate the environment where your users are normally using a measurement device, a tool, a gauge, even a CMM. And we're trying to extract details that's going to give us some useful information about the sources of variation that are inherent in that measurement system. So the purpose of it is really just a way to determine if your measurement system is capable of distinguishing among the parts that you're producing. Essentially, is it up to snuff, and is it willing and able to do the job you're asking it to do?
Okay, and I understand this from the perspective of of the gauges themselves, right? I mean, so you can study the gauges. You can, how much variation is there in the gauge itself? How accurate is the gauge? Over, I don't know, over time or whatever it is you're doing, multiple measurements. How repeatable is the gauge? But I understand the other part of it is the repeatability, so to speak, of the user, the person using the gauge. Now, with a gauge, you can calibrate it. You can document the variation in the gauge itself, so it's a known. How do you deal with a variation in the human who is using the gauge?
So you mentioned the actual piece of equipment, the equipment variation, the repeatability of it. Can we get consistent results? The appraiser variation is going to be very similar, at least it might take as the approach of how to maybe correct or improve. So for a gauge, you can, like you said, maintain it, do regularly scheduled maintenance, do your calibrations, a check for accuracy or trueness. So then you can document those. You can know what this gauge is pretty much capable of. When you give even a great or a perfect gauge to an inexperienced user or a group of inexperienced users, you're going to get some variation. So the approach is, if you've identified, you've done your repeatability and reproducibility study, and you've identified, well, the main source is coming from the operators. The first thing I would probably do is take a look at some of the charts that can go along with one of these studies. You can actually zero in and get different views of some of the data, so you can identify, well, Mary is the person in this case that is an outlier. That doesn't necessarily mean that Mary is wrong. It just means that she is different from the other two appraisers. So just like before, if you have a gauge that might not be working for you, might not be to the accuracy that you need for the measurement system, you'd almost use the same approach with your appraisers. I'm going to do some maintenance on them. We can do training regimens. We can make sure that they are well versed in how to use the gauge. We can review procedures or methods for how they take the measurements. Sometimes organizations overlook that step. So the biggest part is having a conversation with those operators after the study is completed, share the results, talk to them. Sometimes it might even just be a fluke, meaning, well, this operator had to stay an extra shift just to participate in the study. That can explain why some of their measurements were a bit off. So
Right.
all in all, both times, if you have a problem with your gauge, you can improve it, calibrate it, sometimes even replace it. Same thing with your operators. You can train them or retrain them, not necessarily get new ones necessarily, hopefully, you can keep them around, but you might actually ship them to a different role, a job that they might actually be more skilled for. So it's interesting. You get to learn a lot from these R&R studies, and all of it goes towards making more confident measurements so that when you do have a problem, you can trust them on that control chart and on that histogram.
Oh, perfect. And if our viewers are interested in this topic and want to know more about R&R and how to do an R&R, some of the tools that are available for you, what the process might look like, you might like to know that we're bringing you a webinar next week titled The Importance of R&R Studies. Eric Gasper here, who we just spoke with, is your presenter, and I'll be your host. So check it out. The event is coming this coming Tuesday, next Tuesday, November 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. There is a link to register in Eric's article. It's also, there's a link to the webinar also in the player page down underneath there. You can click on that and go out and sign up for what will be an informative webinar. My feeling is anybody who works in manufacturing, anybody who works in who uses gauges really needs to know how to do an R&R, because as Eric explained there, if you don't know what your measurement, the accuracy and repeatability of your measurement system is, you don't really know what you're doing when you're measuring your process. So be sure to sign up for that. And Eric, thanks for being with us this morning.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, we'll talk to you
Thanks,
later.
Eric. See ya.